Okay, so firstly, thank you for inviting me to a very important meeting, because this is such an important thing in the world today, building compassionate communities. So this is a book which I'm going to kind of think about, and I think the point is that when we think about compassion, it's important that we root our understanding of how our minds work and also social problems in order to help and prevent them. But we need to use basic sciences. So what I'm going to be doing is bringing together lots of different sciences in terms of the psychology and how the body works and how the brain works and how social groups work, rather than just having a particular psychotherapeutic orientation. Okay, that's great. Okay, so the first thing really I want to clarify with you is what is compassion from an evolution point of view, because there are quite a lot of definitions now about compassion on the websites. And the view that we take is very much rooted in evolutionary biology, but also Buddhist principles. And the basic idea is that compassion is a motive. We do things because we want to do them, we're motivated, and all motives have what we call algorithms. What that means is there's a part of us that's sensitive and there's a part of us that takes action. So if you think about wanting to eat, there's part of you that's sensitive to food, and there's a part of you that would go out and find food, okay? You'll see how this works as we go along. So basically compassion then is when we have a sensitivity to the suffering and distress of self and others. We pay attention, we notice it, but also we take action. There's a commitment to try to alleviate and prevent it. And in this talk, prevention is going to be very important. So that means then that we have to be able to approach, to be able to detect and engage with suffering. And that also means how we come to understand it and understand its causes. And that requires wise courage. But in addition, just understanding it or approaching it is not enough. We also need to be able to alleviate and prevent suffering. And that means we need skills and wisdom to do that. So these are two very different processes, and I'll come back to that on a number of occasions, because when we're coming to work with communities, understanding the issue by which we understand suffering and which we come to the solutions are very, very important. So compassion then requires courage and wisdom to both be sensitive, to engage, because engaging the suffering is stressful, and also to take action. Courage without wisdom can be reckless. We just jump in. You don't know what we're doing, but we want to be helpful. Whereas wisdom without courage can be ineffective. We know what to do, but we're too frightened to do it. And so building compassionate communities, we require both of these things. And also in the Buddhist traditions, but also in our traditions, we are very interested in addressing the causes of suffering. So in the Buddhist traditions, karuna, which is compassion in Pali, and the Sanskrit is addressing the causes of suffering as well. And so this is very important. It's not just about alleviating, it's addressing the causes and trying to prevent it in the future. So we're going to have to develop communities that prevent suffering, not just respond to it. Now, one of the key things then is to understand that in order to explore the causes of suffering, we must understand our origins, what our brains were evolved to do, what they are capable of, and how to cultivate the good and prevent the harm. Now, I want to be clear that in our approach to compassion, the prevention of harm is very important. Okay, because there's quite a lot on the internet now about it's about being kind and loving. Those things are okay, but the key issue of compassion when it comes to community is to prevent harm. That's going to be very, very important. And we can distinguish that from the helping communities flourish. Those are two different processes, as we will see. Okay. So I'm quickly going to take you through the basic ways in which we can think about the mind and the four functions of mind, and how the four functions of mind are very important when it comes to building compassionate communities. So firstly, then, the first function of mind is to understand motivation. So in the green circle, it's motivation. And these relate to basic life tasks. And all living things have three basic life tasks. And these life tasks are to avoid harm, to not be hurt, to detect threats and respond to threats. Even plants can do that. They could curl their leaves if there's a shortage of water. Animals that can move, species that move, they're able to move away from harm, escape harm. So harm avoidance is a very fundamental motivation for all living things, and you have brain systems designed to pay attention to the potential for harm and then take action. The second one is resource acquisition. You have to not just avoid harms, but you also have to acquire things such as food and resources. And if you're a sexual reproducing organism, you have to find a mate and so on. So acquiring resources to survive and flourish is part of the basic motivational system for all living things. And then the third one is the importance of the ability to rest and digest, to be in a position of safeness and so on. And motives require actions, and actions mean that the body has to be changed according to context. Now, of course, in this society, which is contextual behavioral approaches, emotions have to be linked to the context in which a motive is being pursued. So then we can see that emotions serve and guide motives. They create body states for action. So, and this is really quite important, because if we're working with emotions that are tricky, the chances are we're also dealing with difficult motives. Now, what that means is that we can identify particular classes of emotions associated with motives. So emotions associated with harm avoidance motives, the desire not to be harmed and so on, we call those threat emotions, and those are things like anger, anxiety. Emotions that are associated with acquiring resources and achieving things, they tend to be associated with emotions that make us go out and explore and try and make things happen. And those emotions tend to be, on the whole, not always, positive emotions. They're linked to what we call reward function. And then the third one is we have emotions that are linked to times when we are safe and we can rest and digest, and we can just chill out and be settled in ourselves. We're not dealing with threats, we're not threatened in any way, we're not needing to go out and achieve anything, we're just content. So these are your three basic emotion systems that link to your three fundamental life tasks. And then we also have a third function, which is the function of our abilities to process information. And we call these competencies. Now, competencies are the ways we do things. So, for example, birds need wings to fly, but they also need a brain that will move their wings and fly them in the air, navigate them and so on, so that they don't crash into trees. Why they are flying, the motive or the emotion they are experiencing while they're flying is quite separate from their abilities to fly. Okay, they could be flying because they're escaping a predator or finding food or going back to the nest. Now, so competencies then can fit with any motivation. It doesn't really matter. If you're flying, you're always going to fly in the same way. Now, humans excel at what we call cognitive competencies. And there are three types, probably more than three types. We'll just talk about three types today. And these are the abilities to reason and to think, things through to, it's the scientific mind really, to understand how things work in the world, to do your mathematics, to develop vaccines. It's a thinking brain. It's a brain that can identify problems and solve them. Then the second competency is what we call empathic or mentalizing competencies. And this is the ability to understand that our minds and our behaviors are governed by our motives and our thoughts. Empathy means we can have insight into the minds of others. The minds of others are not like aliens. Okay, and that's a very important function. And there are lots of therapies that help people specifically target their abilities to be empathic or to mentalize. And then the third function is linked to the ability to observe your own mind, to be aware that you are aware, to be conscious of being conscious. And that is the competency which enables us to become mindful. Now, these are different because you can be very clever, you can win a Nobel Prize, but you might not be very empathic. You might not be very sensitive, and you might not be very mindful. On the other hand, you could be a very mindful person and empathic, but you might not be very bright and win Nobel Prizes. So the ways in which these competencies work is really quite important, particularly when it comes to compassion, as we will see. And then the fourth quality is, of course, the issue of behaviors. And again, in this society, contextual behavior therapy, behavior is incredibly important. It doesn't matter how much you know about driving a car or playing the piano. If you don't actually do it, you're not going to get very good at it. And if you do it, you will gain all kinds of insights and wisdoms that you can only gain from the doing of it. Now, that's going to be important when we think about compassion, because it's okay to know about compassion, but can we practice it? Can we actually do it? Can we behave in compassionate ways? Because that's the way it really gets established. Now, all of these have what we call facilitators and inhibitors. Okay, there are things that will inhibit what we feel. There are things that will facilitate anxiety and things that will inhibit anxiety, things that will facilitate, make us angry, and things that will inhibit our anger. For example, if we really care about somebody, we might not want to express a lot of anger to them. And we're going to see that there are facilitators and inhibitors of compassion too. And all of these really are important when we think about building compassionate communities. How can we help communities be motivated towards creating a compassionate orientation within themselves? How can we help communities develop the emotional textures between themselves that will facilitate compassion? If we have communities that are very conflictual, lots of fighting, lots of arguments, a lot of aggression, a lot of anger, that's going to be difficult to build a compassionate community. So we need to be able to heal those divisions and those conflicts. Can we have a community that can think through and work out what it is they need as a community that would help them to flourish as a community? Can we bring people together so they can jointly problem solve? And can we get people working together? Now, in the ACT community, you probably know that people like Dan Sloan Wilson has written a book with Steve Hayes and others called Pro-Social. I'll mention that in a little bit. But they take these sorts of dynamics about how we can develop people to relate together. Now, the key thing is to recognize then that when we look at motivation, we can see that not only do we have the basic motivations, the three, but also we have a number of social motivations. And these motivations organize your mind in a completely different way. So, for example, if you are going to meet your lover tonight, then the way in which you're thinking about what you're going to do and how you're reasoning and where you're going to go, what's going on in your mind, will be very different than if you are motivated to go and see somebody because you need help. If you're thinking about relating to somebody that you need help for, the way you think about them, what you're motivated to do, how your body is working will be very different. And if you are the person who is providing the help, if you are the doctor or the friend or the therapist, then again, how you're paying attention, what you're thinking about, what you're planning to do, and what's happening in your body will again be very different. So motives organize the mind. Now, emotions do too, but emotions come and go. They get turned on and turned off, okay? Whereas motives orientate you towards a specific goal, whereas emotions not necessarily. Okay. So one of the interesting questions is that the problem is with our minds is that they're full of conflicting motivations, and some of which can be very harmful. Some of the evolved motivations we have can be very helpful. So building compassionate societies requires us to understand the evolutionary and social origins of these conflicts, and then build minds and groups and societies that do not stimulate the harmful in us. Okay, compassion is therefore about the prevention of the harmful. And I want to come back to this a lot because sometimes this is missed in standard compassion-focused approaches. It's very important in Buddhism, but it's often missed in Western approaches, because Western approaches are tending to over-focus on things like love and happiness and all that. But in reality, happiness will look after itself if you remove the potential for harm. Now, one of the reasons that we have a potential to harm, and we do, is because there is two basic resource distribution strategies that are playing out in our minds and the minds of many other species. And basically, the ability to acquire resources often requires competition with others. And so what we know is that there are two basic ways in which competition occurs. One is called control and hold. Now, in control and hold, this is a situation where you get groups that are fighting over resources, and the more dominant, the more aggressive gets to the top of the hierarchy, and then they hold on to resources and they stop others from getting access to resources. So this is a particular form of competition where individuals are very self-focused. They want the best for themselves or their families or whatever, but they're not going to do very much for anybody else. On the other hand, there's a very different strategy which became very important when humans moved out of that primate, that sort of monkey kind of world, into what we call hunter-gatherers. And in hunter-gatherers, trying to get what you want through aggression or get to be dominant, that didn't work. Okay, what happened was the group survived and you did well by caring and sharing. And now we know that a lot of our brain is set up for caring and sharing. Part of the problem is, however, that was evolved in small groups of between 100 and 150. With agriculture, what happened was that we started to create wealth. And with wealth, we created an expanded group size, and then we got back into fighting and competing for resources. And then we had the emergence of aggressive males. And these have done untold mischief for thousands of years. All of the major empires of the world have been run by aggressive males, sometimes aggressive females, but mostly aggressive males who they get hold of a lot of power. They hold a lot of power. They have a lot more power than other people. The people below them, the common people, if you want, they don't do so good. So we'll talk about that as we go through. So the point about it is then we have a fundamental problem with competing emotions, competing motives. So these two are constantly battling that out within our own minds and within societies and within groups. So within groups, you've got individuals who are over here, they're competing, push, 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 they want for themselves, they put other people down, they threaten other people down, but you'll also have people who want to be over here, who want to be caring, want to be supportive, okay? But these are often a problem in how you deal with these conflicts. A little bit on social mentality theory. Now, social mentality theory really is linked to this book, which was published in 1989, because although I use a lot of cognitive therapy, I've always been an evolutionist. And this is a book highlighting the fact that we have these different social motives for caring and receiving care and cooperating. And each motivational system, it actually evolved with specific specialized feature detectors and biology. So when you are in a caring relationship, the way you're physiologically responding in that relationship is different than if you were engaged in sex or you're having an argument or a fight, okay? So there are different systems that get turned on and off, and they can get in each other's way. So for example, in order for sex to evolve, there has to be mutual sending and receiving of signals that co-regulate physiological states. You can make mistakes. This poor little squirrel's made a mistake there. When it comes to cooperation, again, what we see is the importance of the interaction between individuals that are tuning in to each other. So cooperation requires complex communication of the shared goals, okay, of the cooperation. What are you trying to achieve? The tasks that need to be undertaken, clarity of who does what, and trust in the other. Because if you don't trust the other, then you're not going to cooperate, are you? So once again, these are complex, reciprocal, and dynamic interactions that people have to understand these roles. Now, when it comes to caring, we know that there have been a number of evolutionary pressures and stages that have given rise to our capacity to care. One of them actually is the preparedness to respond to the injury of others, to rescue and to care for individuals until they recover. That does seem to be quite a specific trajectory, actually. Whoops, that's that one, yeah. This one then of caring for others, rescuing others, even interestingly, even ants do that. Ants will carry their wounded colleagues back to the nest, and where they have a chance of recovering. So that's important. Whoops. So two other dimensions, two other pathways of compassion linking to caring. Caring is not just rescuing behavior, but also attachment behavior, where you're caring for those who are developing or have needs. And this is very important, for example, is the way the parent cares for the child. But caring behavior are concerned with the welfare of the other, concerned with the growth of the other, concerned to see them flourish. That's a very important process in many types of caring relationships. And then the third one, the third trajectory really is this development of group living, where we became very interested, very motivated to prove ourselves valuable to the group. The desire to be valued by the group, the desire to make a contribution and have that contribution appreciated is very, very important to humans. And you'll see this on the internet. The internet is full of people wanting to share their knowledge, teach you how to make cakes or whatever it is. The issue of appreciation, the ability to, I have a place and I'm appreciated for what I bring to the group or whatever, it is very, very important. Now we know that many individuals, particularly in the young, who have felt detached from society, that they don't have a place, that nobody wants them, they don't have anything to offer, or at least they feel the society doesn't really see they have anything to offer. These individuals are quite highly prone to dysfunctional behaviors, both depression and antisocial. And one of the problems is that we have overhyped the competition to show how good you are, to show you've got talent or whatever it is. So that's also an important story. But the key thing to clarified for us these different pathways of compassion, because people are actually different. Some people are good at one, but not the other. Okay, so I showed you that. Now, the other thing to remember then is what that means is that compassion is not a benzo. That means that there are very different types of psychology, different types of motivation according to what you want to be compassionate about. So, for example, if you think of a firefighter, right, entering a building, that person requires a lot of courage and wisdom, and to some extent, so does somebody standing up against injustice. This is Martin Luther King. And then you also need different skills if you're going to be a therapist or a counselor. Or what they all have in common is compassion motivation. They're all motivated to address and prevent suffering. That's what they're doing. That's what they have in common. But they may not have other things in common. For example, the firefighter might be very courageous, but not very empathic. The firefighter might not make a good parent. On the other hand, people who are very good with children might not make very good firefighters. So motivation is crucial, but there are different types of skills and talents that go into being compassionate. And that's very important when we think about compassionate communities. Compassionate communities is partly how do you bring together people with different compassion talents and getting them to work together. So, and how to value the individual, the unique talents that that person brings into your community. Because when people feel devalued, that their skills are not useful, they're much more likely to become disruptive. The other thing to say is this issue about, go back here. The other thing to mention is the issue about the two aspects of compassion, and this is work by the Italian group, and they studied people's reactions and physiological responses to two videos. In one video, individuals were watching distress and having emotional sensitivity and being empathic to the distress they were watching. In the other, they were asked to engage in helpful actions, to think about how you might help in that situation. And what you find is that, they're quite different processes, actually. When you're just being sensitive and engaged, your brain is responding in a different way than when you're working out what to do. And we've shown that if people only are sensitive to distress, but they're not motivated to take action, or they don't know what to do, or they feel overwhelmed because they don't know what to do, that can actually make things worse. Okay, I want to come back to a little bit now on motivational processes, because, as I say, part of creating compassionate communities is to offset our potential to be harmful. And it's very important, right? Facilitators and inhibitors. If you only focus on facilitators and you don't address the inhibitors, you will fail. It's like pouring water into a bucket with a hole in. So you have to understand what the inhibitors of compassion are and how to address them. Now, the fact of the matter is that we're highly orientated towards competitiveness. You'll probably see a lot of discussion about our basic nature is compassionate. That has quite a serious, that's seriously incorrect. When the Buddhists talk about our basic nature, they're not talking about the brain. They're talking about the nature of consciousness itself. They're talking about self-transcendence, non-duality, the experience of being part of all things. And that's fine, that's great. But that's not the same as saying that we are biologically, our basic nature is compassionate, because it's all contextual. So you're going to love this as CBS. It's all contextual. In some contexts, we're incredibly compassionate, particularly to our own children and so forth and so on. But in other contexts, like with our enemies or the other group or whatever, we can be pretty nasty. And I'll explain that in a moment. We have the potential to be compassionate, but we also have the potential to be one of the most vicious, nasty species It's not about basic nature. It's really about what the ACT community has always said. Context is everything. Context is what will bring out the good or the bad. And therefore, understanding that process, which is what your society does, is so fundamental. Now, we know that many species have evolved capacities purely to be able to engage in conflict. Okay. So there we are, there's a few more there. This is the long-horned mountain goat, and at certain parts of the year, they will crash into each other up to 35 kilometers an hour, and they've got very thick skulls. So there's an evolution then of specific abilities purely in order to be in conflict. Okay, so here's some primate ways, including war, unfortunately. Now, one of the things to be clear about then is that in the competitive motivational system means that you are concerned with inflicting suffering, creating distress, stimulating fear. That's what you want to do if you're into this kind of competition, which this is where we evolved from. We evolved out of this type of competition. And you certainly are not empathic to the distress that you're causing. If anything, the more distress, fear you cause, the more good it is for you. Okay, and this is a problem. This is quite a serious problem for the human mind. Oops. Primates do show reconciliation and so forth. Hence, once again, we've got to think about contextual sensitivity. But I wanted to get this point across because when individuals are engaged in high competitive behavior, the empathy for the damage they are causing is turned off. All right, that's important. And that's partly to do with the way the brain is wired. Okay, it's to do with what we call the social mentality. It's designed that way because if you became very empathic to the suffering you were causing, then you wouldn't be able to engage in that. But that's what animals do, right? So the key thing then is to, the key thing is to recognize that this also goes with, if you're threatened by a more powerful other, then you have to submit. So there is this dominant submissive relationship, and that's important because, as we will see, one of the problems for humans is that they can submit to authority, hierarchy, like Hitler or whatever, and then they end up doing really bad things because they are obeying. Okay, but we can come back to that in a moment. Now, groups also compete. Cindarius and Proto and Ho and colleagues, they've been really studying and orientating to resource distribution, how people get hold of control of resources and hold on. And it's called social dominance orientation. This measures the frequency to favor hierarchical and unequal rather than egalitarian care and share forms of social organization within and between groups. So once again, we have to recognize there are real forces at work here that will try to disrupt the creation of compassionate communities unless we address them. And the dominance dimension is characterized by support for overt oppression, in-group behaviors designed to maintain subordination of one group or another, whereas anti-egalitarian dimension entails a preference for intergroup inequalities that are maintained by an interrelated work of subtle hierarchies. Now, you can see this all the time in things like the suppression of women's rights, the racism, or the ways in which this motivation will seek to create cultures and contexts which facilitate their ability to stay in control, their ability to stay superior, and for the others to be inferior. So again, quite a lot of research out there. That's what I've been, getting across. We need the research. We need to base compassion on research. That we're going to have to address that, because if we don't address that, these motivational processes in some people will start to filter their way through and so on and so on, particularly when individuals are under threat. We know that when people feel under threat, you can have leaders that come along and say, I will make you great. I will make you special. I will protect you. I am your protector. Okay, we've got somebody in the States who plays that card very well. Highly manipulative, okay? But it's working this motivational system. So we have to find counter ways of dealing with that kind of stuff. Now, the other point to say is, as I've said, and I'll say this quickly, is that we have to come to terms. We have to have the courage to recognize that humans are the nastiest species. It's all very well to go on and say, oh, we're designed to be loving. Well, yes, we are to our families and friends and groups, but very clearly, many situations and people where we haven't been, you know, if you think of slavery, how horrible that was, and you know, the Roman games, crucifixions, the way we've executed people, and so on and so on, the criminalities that are going on right now, the treatment of women. I mean, there's so many things. And that's a tragedy, because on the other side, we do have this potential. So when we're thinking about creating compassionate communities, we always have to think about this balance between what is pushing the harmful, what's pushing the harmful, and what's pulling for the helpful. It's very important. Okay, I'll go through this quite quickly because I want to get to the solutions. Now, this is important because we have known for a long time about these two dimensions of the psyche, what the Buddhists have called the poisons of the mind, and you can have what are called near and far enemies of compassion. I won't go into that too much. But what's really quite important is these three dimensions. You have the compassion, which is the sensitivity to suffering. And then you have the callousness. Now, callousness is insensitivity to suffering. Now, that means that you're not particularly wanting to create it, but if you do, you don't care. So like the fossil fuel industries, they're not, you know, it would be great if coal didn't create the problems that it's creating. They're not trying to create problems, but the fact that they are, they're not bothered about it. So we know then that the ways in which we're using resources is harmful. We know that, but we're not actually doing a lot about it. So that's callousness, because we've got other things to do. We're pursuing our own self-interest. Cruelty, on the other hand, is when harm is what you want to do. That is absolutely the point of it. And all forms of bullying really fall into that. Vengeance, power, control. You know, we've got many governments around the world right now who are basically using torture and violence to suppress opposition. And so that is the intention. The intention is to control through fear. Okay, so we'll go on. So let's now come into caring, because we need to think about that now. So we've seen then what we're up against. We're up against some pretty tricky forces that are both linked to the evolution of the brain, but also the context. Okay. What about caring behavior? Well, we've spoken a little bit about the social mentality of caring behavior and how that evolved. So there needs to be a carer and a care receiver. So the caring has to evolve together, because if the parent evolves caring behavior, but the infant hasn't evolved an ability to detect it and respond to it, the relationship isn't going to work. You know, the mother is caring and stroking the baby, and the baby's thinking, what is she doing? I mean, this is ridiculous. Why is she stroking me? I have no idea. Why is she smiling at me like that? So you need to, with all of these processes, dominant, subordinate behavior, all of that stuff, you have to co-evolve them, very importantly. Okay, so that takes us to the issue about what it is to be caring. As a mother, the mother is sensitive to the distress of her infant, baby, and also the needs, and will act to do things about it. That is your basic caring algorithm, really. And that's the archetypal thing. And that's what's going to be involved in compassion. That's where compassion really comes from. So you can see that we can plot compassion through the evolutionary journey of being sensitive and then be motivated to take action and working out what's going to happen, what's going to be helpful. Okay. Now, what's interesting is that when we look at caring in a little bit more detail, particularly in attachment theory, we can see that what a caring parent does for the child psychologically, she does a lot, or he does a lot physically, well, feeding and so forth, is called a secure base. Now, secure base has a number of different processes. The reason I'm presenting this to you is I'm going to suggest to you that this is also what caring communities do. Small caring communities, this is what they do. They are communities which encourage, they validate, and they create context where people can have fun. Caring communities also have to have context where people can enjoy themselves, okay? And I'll come on to that a bit more. And caring communities have to also be sources where people can settle, where they can turn to others and feel that others will support them and care about them when they're in trouble. So this is how attachment theory works. It's what the parent does, but it's not only what a parent does, it's what a friend will do, it's what a community can do as well. Once we've got the idea about what is the secure base, how does it work, what is a safe haven, how does it work, we can begin to think about how we get this going in our communities. The other thing is that we know that with the evolution of caring behavior and affiliative behavior, there was a whole range of physiological systems which were impacted by that. Now, I'm not going to go into that, but whether you are feeling cared for by others or whether you feel cared for by your community has profound effects on this. We know now that, for example, people who feel very lonely, who are detached from their communities, have low levels of friends, little social interaction. This is not good for their health at all. So when we say, you know, our natural psychology is social and caring for each other, that's true within small groups. That's always the case. And when individuals are not getting that, they tend to suffer. So you're wanting to have a community, when you're looking at creating compassionate communities, you're also looking at communities that have physiological impacts. And I'll talk a little bit about that later. Okay, I won't get too much into that because I've done that. So that's some of the work that's going on now, not just in compassion focused therapy. And this is the book I mentioned to you on pro-social. I'll talk to you about it again in a moment. But there's quite a lot now looking about how we can nurture the compassionate side of the mind, not just the negative sides. Okay. So let's coming towards the end now. Let's have a think about this. So we've talked a lot about the domains of the regulation of the harmful. And when you're building compassionate societies, a compassionate world, you have to be able to do that. One of them is linked to developing compassions within politics. So this is an interesting group here, which you can go and see on the website. Now, this group of individuals are bringing politicians together to think carefully about how policies are developed, and that no policy should be passed in a government that knowingly harms those least able to protect themselves. So, for example, our period of time called austerity has been severely criticized by the United Nations because we know those policies of austerity have seriously damaged our infrastructure, our health service, and also the burden fell on. So that's important. Another, so really thinking that how do we have politicians that become interested in a compassionate, and that means compassion is helping people to flourish and helping people not be experienced to harms as best we can, right? That's, remember, those are your two motivations, and getting politicians to agree to that would be very important. We also know that there's an awful lot now going on in terms of understanding compassion in business. We've got the Me Too movement, for example, they're beginning to bring awareness to the exploitation, primarily of women, but not only of women, and how important it is to call it out and stop it, right? We have to create environments where this bullying behavior and sexual harassment behavior is simply not acceptable. That's part of a compassion, right? That's part of compassion. The determination, the courage, and the wisdom to address that which is harmful. Very, very important. So now if we think about creating the safe environments with communities, one of the things that people are often surprised about is that you must have appropriate policing. Okay, it would be great, wouldn't it, if we lived in small societies, small groups where we could police each other. That's what hunter-gatherer societies do, but that doesn't work in big groups. And so what does it mean to have compassionate policing? There is such a thing. There is a movement called compassionate policing. This involves law enforcement being engaged and building collaborative relationships with the communities. The police are very embedded in the community. They're not distant. They share common interests. They agree the common interests. They agree the common processes of policing those communities, and they take a sense of shared responsibility. And that means they have to develop mutual trust. These are things that can be built. There are also things that can be lost. It's very clear that we have some communities where the community is incredibly hostile to the police because they don't trust them. And that means then you need, that means that you need the four essentials, that your police forces should be seen as a very major impact of a civil society, that it's properly funded, which in our society is constantly underfunded, that the staff are properly trained and salaried and so forth, that they're properly supported, particularly because policing can be incredibly stressful. I used to work for a police group with traumatized police people who'd been beaten up or seen horrible car accidents and so on. Some of the work of police people are pretty awful and monitored, because we also know that groups like police will attract the psychopaths. And if you get psychopathic characters into your service, they can do all kind of harm because they suppress and they create environments of fear. And we know, because we've had some awful experiences in the UK, that we've had police who have actually been serial rapists and serial killers. So you must have a very carefully monitored service. If you're going to put people with that much power, you've got to monitor them very, very carefully. And that's important because there's also many, many people in the police service who want to do good. They want to do good, but there are those that will be attracted who are very harmful. So again, you know, we can't dodge the issue. We need a police force. The question is, how do we create a compassionate police force? How do we do that? How do we ensure that? How do we ensure that we can trust the people who are looking after us, will protect us, and can deal with difficult situations without actually becoming murderers or whatever? The other thing is, in terms which I'm very interested in, is the concept of local and international law and its enforcement. That is one of the greatest challenges to humanity, because without it, if we don't sort out international law, we are going to be continually plagued by tyrants like Putin and so on. They're going to constantly be cropping up, like what's happening in Sudan right now. And in so many countries, the way these very destructive individuals get into positions of power and then cause all kinds of damage. And we don't have international law at the moment to constrain them. We haven't worked out how we can do that. Now, if we had people that were doing that within a community, within a town, you'd arrest them and put them in jail. But in the world, we can't do that. So compassion then requires us to work very carefully on international law and work out how we can do it. I haven't the foggiest idea. I've got one or two ideas, but not much of an idea, because it's very, very complicated. It's very tricky, because you can't just go into a country and arrest that person. It's very difficult, but we have to find some way, because obviously, you know, the Putins and other peoples of this world, they'll keep emerging, and one day we'll get somebody who will just end all of our lives, unfortunately. Okay, so the next thing then is, so these are ways in which you prevent the harmful, and there are ways in which, as compassion scientists, compassion thinkers, we have to work on, because some of those solutions are not terribly obvious. So let's think about how we can feed the helpful. Well, the first thing is we need to develop a science of community support based on understanding how securities create a secure base. How do they create a secure base? How do they create environments where people feel supported and understood and encouraged? How do they create a safe haven where people feel they can turn to others? If they're distressed, others will support them and help them. And so that's a very crucial area of research, really. So there we are. That's that one again. I should show you that one again. And we need to fund and disseminate research and counteract what I call the sentimentality and compassion. What's happened in the last 10 years is compassion narratives have become sentimental. It's all about love, and you've got to love. And this is a misunderstanding about love, because, as I say, in the Buddhist traditions, the concept of love comes out from self-transcendence, the concepts of interconnectedness. That's a tricky experience to have. You know, people are exploring psychedelics and things at the moment, but if you don't have that experience, if you don't have an experience of that process of self-transcendent, then everything else, you're just trying to imagine what it's like. So that doesn't work. Okay. Oops. There are increasing movements to bring compassion into schools, and here are some websites which you could have when you have it. I won't go into them now. And we've done studies looking at how we can bring compassion into schools, the education of our children for compassion, the teaching them how to use compassion for themselves, to help the way their brain works, teach them mindfulness, very, very important, but also to teach them pro-social behavior, extremely important. We also know that compassion is linked to altruism, but some compassion is really about being heroic. That is the preparedness for us to do things, even though they are costly to us. And this is some of the work of Phillips and Bardo and others who are doing that work. And I put some, and Paul Ekman, I put some links here for you, which when you get the slides, you can see. So this is Phil's, this is Phil's project, the Heroic Imagination Project. And that's also about helping, teaching people, particularly young people, how to be heroically compassionate, how to go out and make things happen, how to address injustice and so on and so forth, how to stand up against harmfulness. And do have a look at the Heroic Imagination Project. It's absolutely terrific. And then there's the pro-social, which is from people like Dan, Sloan Wilson and so forth. And here the science of pro-social approach is to focus on our understanding of, again, self-focused motivation versus concern for the other, and fostering social contacts in which individual and group interests become aligned. So how can you get people to align with the group interest? How can we get people of the world to align with some of the values that we do need to pursue, increasing social justice, increase social fairness, increase the distribution of resources so it's not all bounced up at the top, and so on and so on. How can we get people to align to that and begin to work together, and so on? Okay. Oops. Another thing is to identify actually working with communities. And this is a wonderful book by Julian Abel and Lindsay Clark. And they worked with a particular town, literally developing compassionate communities, identifying people in the town that were very lonely, developing groups to bring individuals in, identifying the strengths within community and linking those strengths into community process. So do have a look at that. And I've got an interview with him on my website. And what they found was that over a period of time, accidents, emergency went down, mental health problems improved. Quite a lot of really, really interesting data when you get communities working together. And Julian and Lindsay give some very interesting ways in which how you do that. I'll give you one example, which is from the thing called the Beacon Project. And this was a GP who had gone to a working class poor estate, and a lot of the women there were single parent mums and were quite poor, and so she was giving them drugs for their depression. But then she decided this isn't, so she called them all together. She had the whole estate, she called the estate together. This is an estate meeting, all coming together. She said, look, you know, a lot of you are struggling with depression and anxiety. Why don't we as a community, all of us, start to support each other? And so she got them meeting regularly, she got them interacting regularly, she got them taking an interest in each other. And over a period of about 6 months or whatever, the baby's health improved, the use of antidepressants went right down, depression went down, they built a crash. Some women went off and got jobs and brought money back. So, you know, the key thing is we do have ways in which we can work with communities. We just need to kind of get that out there. Okay, so I think I'll stop at this point because I've come to the end of my time. But I would like to say to you that we have a terrible dark side. We've got some serious, serious problems ahead. There's no question about that. And we're going to need all of our courage and wisdom. But on the other hand, we've got reasons to be very hopeful because we're beginning to understand how we can bring compassion to help our minds, how compassion can help us with our mental health difficulties. We're bringing compassion into schools, we're bringing compassion into business, bringing compassion into law, trying to understand that if compassion is the prevention of harm and the pursuit of flourishing, we need laws to do that, and we're bringing compassion into politics. So, you know, and then you've got the pro-social work of Wilson and Hayes and so on and so on. So, you know, what's great, my last comment, is the world is waking up to issues of compassion. And compassion is not about I love you, you love me. That's all very nice. You keep that for your friends. Compassion is this dedication, the courage and the wisdom and the dedication that you will address suffering, the causes of suffering, and wherever you can, you will create the conditions for flourishing. Now, if we take that, that's great. And that doesn't mean to say you have to love people. You might not love them, but you'll still do that for them. Thank you so much for inviting me, and have a wonderful conference.